Hey guys, if you're watching this, it should be Thursday. Now, yesterday you would have read Chapter 5, Sections 1 and 2 about Conestoga wagons and canals. Now, that may not sound the most exciting, and maybe your reading really wasn't, but hopefully today and tomorrow we can make it a little bit better and a little bit more meaningful. Now, as always, you already know, we're going to start with the bell ringer. Number 1, what is your favorite piece of technology today? I want you to think hard about it, take some time, and pretty much just list the piece that you could not live without. Okay. Hopefully, all of your answers are totally different than each other's. Number 2, what do you consider the most important piece of technology or technology of our history to be? So, again, I want you to think hard, and it doesn't have to be anything even in the last 20 years. It could be something older, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 2,000 years ago. Okay. Think hard, and again, hopefully your answers vary. Remember to pause this part of the video, answer the questions and comments on Google Classroom. Alrighty, so as our objectives for today and tomorrow read to describe the contributions from Conestoga wagons and canal systems to PA's economy, well, we will do that, but first, or at least for today's video, I really want to spend some time to start setting the tone for Pennsylvania, setting the context of Pennsylvania, and even the U.S. at this time. Before we talk about wagons and the canals, let's discuss everything else going on during the 1790s to 1830s. We'll talk about that 40-year period. Let's get into it. As a quick review about what we already went over, well, you have a large population in the Americas. Eventually you get European colonization. William Penn comes, he works it out with the natives. He dies, his kids take over very quickly, the relations deteriorate, and then we want to keep expanding, but there's French territory that leads to one war, and that war leads to another war, and then eventually you get the United States of America is created, and Pennsylvania actually becomes a state, all right? So after all those conflicts, eventually we get peace. Well, just kidding. During the early national period in Pennsylvania, when it first becomes a state, there's tons of conflicts. So let's look at it. Early Pennsylvania as a state and our nation in general had its fair share of trouble to start. A lot of this had to do with taxes and debt that PA had. Remember, they were in a depression after the Revolutionary War. When you're trying to collect the taxes from the people that didn't really want to pay taxes before, of course you will run into trouble. For example, those collecting taxes were surrounded and beaten commonly. Sometimes even the tax collectors would be dressed up in women's clothes, I guess to be more humiliating, as they were beaten trying to collect taxes, say, from western PA farmers. As bad as that sounds, that's much better alternative than being stripped naked and having boiling hot tar poured onto you and being feathered. It sounds funny, it's a thing of movies and stuff, but it's actually very brutal, leaves you scarred forever. Sometimes even these western farmers in PA would even go straight to the tax collector's office and do the same thing, or even go to his home, where there's plenty of accounts of them harassing and even assaulting the tax collector's family, wife, kids, and everything. Furthermore, you had thousands of soldiers that came back beaten, disfigured, or even mentally scarred that never got paid for their service. Remember, they basically did IOUs to even make a makeshift army very quickly to fight against the British in the Revolutionary War. So later they tried to curb this by giving the angry veterans some land out in western PA and beyond. Many times the veterans just sold it. Before that point, there's plenty of other unrest and rebellion, such as Shays' Rebellion, and that was in Massachusetts. But in Pennsylvania, you'd have Whiskey Rebellion, which was based on a tax on whiskey that hurt Pennsylvania farmers and they were angry. And even Fry's Rebellion. Fry's was kidnapping tax collectors, and he wanted equal taxes, not based on how many windows in your house, which at this time, after the Whiskey Rebellion, Congress would take away the tax on whiskey, but then they would put up other new ones, such as gold or silver or land or houses, and it would be determined on, I'm not kidding, on how many windows you had in your house. So after these rebellions were put down, to try to curb it more, all the civil unrest, all the rebellions, the government would pass the Alien and Sedition Acts, and that would lock up immigrants and citizens that talked negatively about the government, which is an example of a violation of free speech. So let's keep moving forward with some of the events. Later, we get the War of 1812 against the British. Historically, the U.S. has only declared war 5 times, but we have been to war over 120 times, and probably, if you count some other things, probably over 400 times, proxy wars, interventions, armed conflicts, occupations, and so on. So this was one of the earliest ones after we become a nation. A quick note, we are technically at war or conflict with 7 nations today: Libya, Niger, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Somalia. Just as a heads up, because when we do dive into history, we want to think about today, and I think that's kind of like something uncommon that a lot of people don't know. Anyway, the biggest reason for this war, the War of 1812, was trade. The U.S. wanted to trade with other nations, but the British wanted to be the only trading partner. Okay, this kind of mimics some of the complaints of the British during the Revolutionary War, if we can remember that. The U.S. wanted to trade with everybody, but it's not what the British wanted. Many didn't want war in the U.S., and it actually barely passed Congress. Many in the South did want us to go to war, though, and even take more land, such as Canada. But we didn't, and in the words of John Green, now we are Canada's pants. During the war, for the most part, the U.S. continuously lost and lost and lost, to the point that the president was actually almost captured and the White House was burned to the ground. Allegedly, when the British were showing up at the White House, the food on the table was still warm and they just escaped. But eventually we get a few victories, such as a victory in Erie. This gave us control of the Great Lakes and would help us build an economy all around Erie, because we sent soldiers there and sailors and shipbuilders and so on. This war would also impact the natives negatively, who would get kicked out since their allies, the British, were finally dealt with in the colonies. No one really won this war between the U.S. and the British. They both just kind of moved on. But we for sure do have losers, and that again is the natives. Another impact that we do get out of this is a song from Francis Scott Key, The Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem. And in our country, as you guys probably noticed, we really love our songs and our symbols and our flags and our traditions and our customs and so on. Another part of this time is a huge population boom. There's a ton of immigration at this time. Immigration in PA grew tremendously, especially from the Irish. In addition to that, there was also many Italians and Jewish immigrants that also joined the population. Many times in our history, and even other countries' histories, often when you get large immigration groups, there's constantly struggles and controversies, unfortunately. Often it's taking some time for different groups to be accepted, and this part of our history is not really an exception to that. Anyway, at this time, from 1770 to just 1800, in that 30-year period, our population more than doubles in Pennsylvania, and the same can be said about our country's population too. People are coming in droves. So just when you thought I was done talking about war, we actually have another one, the Mexican War. We also go to war with Mexico, which we had plenty of divided public opinion at this time, but after it's done, we do get the top half of Mexico. It also gave plenty of famous Civil War generals that we'll talk about later their first big experience at war. Many saw it as expansionist land grab against a new and weak country, since Mexico was relatively new, and that President Polk just wanted to provoke a war so he could get additional slave states. And there's a good case to be made that that is true. But anyway, it was a very brutal war, and there was plenty of atrocities committed. If you'd like to learn more about that, I can send you some resources. Native attacks, raids, and wars were still going on at this time, mostly on the western side of PA, and smallpox never really went away either. It was still an issue that they dealt with. And in addition to that, we still had the British and the Spanish still not honoring their treaties and occupying forts in U.S. land. Another big one for Pennsylvania was the yellow fever epidemic. In 1793, Philadelphia's population of 50,000 at the time, the largest city until the turn of the century, lost 10% of their population, so we have over 5,000 dying in Philadelphia. It was believed that French refugees and slaves from the Caribbean brought in yellow fever to Philly, since the disease was common in port cities. This disease was spread by mosquitoes, and quarantine would have been done for about 5 days or so. It begins like the flu, with headaches, chills, vomiting, aches, and a fever, but within 24 hours, the skin becomes jaundice. Now, what jaundice means is that your skin basically turns yellow. The same thing with your eyes, and this is all due to liver failure. Later, other organs shut down, and then you die. Your body literally turns off. So patients can die within 1 to 2 days, and this was happening all over Philadelphia. In Philly, hospitals turned away infected patients. They set up temporary quarantine centers. The governor asked healthy people to actually leave the city and get out. And it was so bad at some points, like October 7th to the 13th, over 700 people died. You have to think about that. That's 100 people every day. Now, while that is bad, if we want to talk about some of the stuff and compare it to today, COVID in PA, for instance, steadily was around 70 to maybe 150. On our worst day in Pennsylvania, it was 341. Also, isolation was encouraged and public gatherings were prevented. Sound familiar? The governor, Benjamin Rush, he was also a leading medical scientist, interestingly enough. One weird thing that he did push was having black nurses take care of the patients because he thought that they had a natural immunity. Well, they did not. He also pushed bloodletting, which is getting rid of all your bad blood, and even purging, which is forcing yourself to vomit. So clearly our medical practices back then were not the greatest and probably even led to more deaths. Another interesting fact is that Washington actually died this way using one of the practices called bloodletting, and that's where they would drain 40% of his blood. Later, and luckily, the cold weather of the late fall and the winter would kill off most of the mosquitoes. The fever would come back in the next few years, but death counts were nothing like they were at that point. They never got that high again. And also, everybody's able to better deal with it and keep isolated. Yellow fever still exists today, but is mostly in underdeveloped countries that do not have the same access to medicine or vaccines as we do for prevention. Another part of this time is also the huge anti-slavery movement going on in Pennsylvania. And this was not the first time either. If you remember, Pennsylvania had one of the first, if not the first, abolitionist movement where Quakers in Pennsylvania in 1688 would protest and petition. This actually happened in Germantown, Pennsylvania. We were also the first state to ban slavery, if we remember. Vermont technically was the first, but they were a colony, not a state. They did that 3 years before us. But we would be the first state to ban slavery. And then later, even in our history, Pennsylvania was huge with the Underground Railroad as being a destination, and even had plenty of towns that would defy the Fugitive Slave Act. Let's keep going. Another part is education in Pennsylvania, where plenty in Pennsylvania were fighting for free public education and working out the education system in general. And now look where we're at this point. You watching me through your Chromebook. All right. So I'm almost done setting the stage for you guys to get on to our actual content. Expansion. All right. One last point to make about our country is that we actually doubled our land size at the time with the Louisiana Purchase. I suppose I went a little bit out of order because I talked about Mexico and the war with them. But that's okay. Anyway, the French were almost bankrupt from the wars against the British, and they needed to save money. Remember, the French helped us, and that kind of hurt them. They weren't the biggest fans of having colonies after the Haitian Revolution, and that's where slaves actually fought against the French oppressors, and they were willing to part from the land to help bail them out of their debts. In fact, Napoleon was quoted as saying, "Damn sugar, damn coffee, damn colonies." So clearly, he wasn't a fan. They sold this huge chunk of land for a mere $15 million, which is something like $250 million today. So the price of 6 Apache helicopters. And sure, this was a great deal for Thomas Jefferson, who purchased it. Kind of unconstitutionally, well, he just did it. After this, we get the famous Lewis and Clark, who explored the land for about 2 years, after they trained in Pennsylvania. Thomas Jefferson was excited to see what they find out there, especially after some mammoth and mastodon excavations. Thomas Jefferson might say, well, we don't know what's out there. Who knows? It could be anything. Okay. Now the final piece of the puzzle for you all. Booming industries. Pennsylvania had a growing industrial economy where it would thrive and allow Pennsylvania to not just be an agricultural farming empire, but also an industrial one. The biggest reasons why have to do with Pennsylvania's huge population, the new technology, and then also the vast amount of resources it has. And everything I just said is exactly what Chapter 5 is about: technology and the booming industries. Alrighty. Now, to close for today's video, I just wanted to set the stage for what's going on in Pennsylvania. And one last thing I want to mention is that you can see history through many different lenses, and we do this all the time. You can see it through the lens based on your identity. Maybe it's from the US perspective or a Christian perspective. Sometimes people look at history through a bunch of different conflicts, like nation versus nation, or a religion against another religion, or non-religions, maybe good versus evil, rich versus poor. But maybe a better way to see it might be men and women working together to survive. But another way we can look at it, and that we will, especially for our next couple lessons, have to do with humans conquering nature. Thanks for watching, guys. As a last review of what we covered today, we looked at early Pennsylvania and the early national period, going over 40 years or so in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And this includes taxes, rebellions, civil unrest, a depression, a huge population boom, native issues that would continue. There was a yellow fever epidemic, continued anti-slavery movement, a push for education in Pennsylvania, a giant land expansion, and then even a giant land grab from Polk. And then we ended with introducing the inevitable industrial period for Pennsylvania due to its huge population, vast resources, and new technology. That's all I have for you guys today, and we will continue through this stuff tomorrow. Have a good one, guys. Bye. All right, say bye to kids.